The champagne bottle popped with a sharp crack that echoed through the living room of the modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street. Laura's mother, Nancy, squealed with delight as the fizzy liquid overflowed, spilling onto the carpet that Harris had saved for months to replace. Her father, Donald, raised his glass high, his face flushed with an excitement that seemed obscene given the black wreath still hanging on the front door. "To freedom," Donald declared, his voice booming through the house where, just 3 days ago, mourners had gathered to pay their respects to Harris Chen, the hardworking construction worker who had died in a tragic accident on the Peterson Tower site. Laura stood in the center of the room, her mourning clothes already discarded for a tight red dress that Harris had always said made her look cheap. She wasn't crying anymore. In fact, she was smiling, a wide, relieved smile that would have broken Harris's heart if he could have seen it from wherever he was now. $500,000, Nancy said, clutching the insurance papers to her chest like they were treasure maps. $500,000, and that's not even counting the lawsuit settlement from the construction company. They're liable for not having proper safety measures. We could get another $1 million easy. Our prayers have been answered, Laura said, taking a long sip of champagne. Finally, I can get out of this dump. No more penny pinching. No more wearing the same dress twice. No more putting up with that boring, broke excuse of a husband, her younger sister Erica finished, laughing as she scrolled through her phone, already shopping for luxury handbags online. If you're watching this story right now, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. And make sure you share this with your friends, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 6 months earlier, Harris Chen woke up at 4:30 every morning, just as he had done for the past 8 years. The alarm on his phone, a cheap model he'd been using for 3 years because he couldn't justify buying a new one, buzzed quietly in the darkness. He silenced it quickly, not wanting to wake Laura, though she rarely stirred before 10 these days. He moved through the small house like a ghost, making his coffee in the kitchen where the cabinet door still hung crooked because he hadn't had time to fix it. His lunch was already packed. 2 sandwiches he'd made the night before, an apple, and a thermos of water. He couldn't afford to buy lunch at the food trucks near the construction sites. At 42 years old, Harris's hands were calloused and scarred from years of manual labor. His back ached constantly. His knees creaked when he climbed the steel frames of the buildings he helped construct. But he never complained. He had responsibilities. He had a wife who deserved nice things, even if she never seemed satisfied. He had bills to pay and dreams, small, modest dreams, of maybe one day opening a little hardware store where he could use his skills without destroying his body. "You're leaving already?" Laura's voice came from the bedroom doorway. She stood there in an expensive silk nightgown that Harris didn't remember buying. Her hair was wrapped in a designer scarf, and even half asleep, she looked annoyed. "Site opens at 6, Harris said, forcing a smile. "Big day today. We're starting the upper floors on the Peterson Tower. If I do well, Frank, that's the foreman. He said he might recommend me for a supervisor position. More money, Laura. Maybe 20% more." Laura yawned, unimpressed. 20% of not much is still not much, Harris. My mother called yesterday. She needs money for her medication again. Harris felt his stomach tighten. Nancy's medication was a constant drain on their finances. Last month it was her heart pills. The month before, her arthritis treatment. Harris suspected most of the money went to Nancy's shopping addiction. But he never said anything. Keeping peace in the family was more important. "How much?" he asked quietly. $300. She needs it by Friday." $300. That was half of what Harris had managed to save this month. He'd been planning to finally fix the car's transmission, which was making terrible grinding noises. But he nodded. "Okay, I'll cash my check early." "You're such a good son-in-law," Laura said, but there was no warmth in her voice. She turned back toward the bedroom, then paused. "Oh, and Erica's birthday is next week. She wants that new iPhone, the expensive one." Harris's heart sank. "Laura, honey, that's almost $1,500. We can't what, Harris? Disappoint my baby sister? After everything my family has done for us?" Laura's voice rose sharply. "They helped us with the down payment on this house, remember?" Harris did remember. He also remembered that the help was a loan, one he'd been paying back for 5 years at an interest rate that would make a loan shark blush. But he didn't argue. He never did. "I'll figure something out," he said. At the Peterson Tower construction site, the morning air was crisp and cold. Harris pulled on his hard hat and safety harness, checking every buckle twice the way he always did. Safety wasn't just a rule for Harris. It was a religion. He'd seen too many men get hurt, too many families destroyed by one moment of carelessness. "Chen, get up to floor 23. We need help with the beam installation," Frank shouted from below. Harris climbed. 23 floors up, the wind whipped through the skeletal structure of the building. Below, the city of Denver sprawled out like a toy model. Up here, Harris felt almost free. Up here, the weight of his struggles felt smaller, more manageable. "Careful with that beam, Harris. She's a heavy one," said Paul, a younger worker who Harris had taken under his wing. They worked together, guiding the massive steel beam into place. It was dangerous work, requiring perfect coordination. One wrong move, one distracted moment, and someone could die. Harris's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Never check your phone while working at height. That was rule number 1. But it buzzed again. And again. During their break, Harris finally looked. 7 messages from Laura, all demanding he call her immediately. With a sinking feeling, he dialed. "Where have you been?" Laura's voice was sharp with irritation. "Working, sweetheart. I can't answer the phone when I need you to transfer money right now. There's a sale at Nordstrom, and these shoes I've been watching are finally discounted. If I don't buy them in the next hour, they'll be gone." Harris looked at his rough, calloused hands, at the dirt under his fingernails. He thought about those hands building towers that touched the sky while his wife screamed at him about shoes. "How much?" he asked, his voice hollow. $450. They're designer, Harris. An investment." "Laura, we talked about this. We need to save. I'm trying to put money aside for what? For your stupid hardware store dream? Harris, wake up. You're 42 years old. You're a construction worker. That's all you'll ever be. The least you can do is make sure your wife doesn't have to live like we're poor when we're not actually poor. We have credit cards. We have your paycheck. Stop being so stingy." The words hit Harris like physical blows. He wanted to argue, to explain that they were drowning in debt, that the credit cards were maxed out, that his paycheck barely covered their bills even before her family's constant demands. But what was the point? "I'll transfer the money," he said quietly. That night, Harris came home to find Laura's parents had invited themselves for dinner. Nancy sat on the couch like a queen holding court, criticizing everything from the outdated furniture to the generic brand of crackers Harris had bought. "Laura deserves so much better than this," Nancy said, not even bothering to lower her voice. "My daughter is a beautiful woman. She could have married anyone. And she chose you." Donald nodded in agreement, helping himself to another beer from Harris's fridge. "You know, my buddy Lucas is looking for someone to invest in his car dealership. If you had any ambition, Harris, you'd borrow some money, get in on the ground floor, make some real money for a change." "Borrow from where?" Harris asked, exhausted. "We're already in debt." "That's because you're not thinking big," Donald said dismissively. "You're too cautious, too afraid. That's why you'll never get ahead." Harris excused himself and went to the garage. the only place in the house where he felt any peace. Among his tools and half-finished projects, he let himself imagine a different life. A life where his efforts were appreciated, where his wife looked at him with love instead of disappointment, where he didn't feel like a failure every single day. His phone buzzed. A text from Laura. "My parents are staying the weekend. They need to borrow $800 for their mortgage. Don't embarrass me by saying no." Harris sat down on his workbench, put his head in his hands, and for the first time in years, he cried. Silent tears that came from somewhere deep inside, from a place where he'd buried his disappointment and pain and exhaustion. He didn't know it then, but in exactly 3 months and 4 days, he would be dead. And the people eating his food, spending his money, and calling him a failure would be celebrating his death, like it was the best thing that ever happened to them. But there was something they didn't know. Something that would turn their celebration into something else entirely. Something that was waiting, hidden in the paperwork Harris had been too busy, too distracted by their demands, to properly review. The weeks leading up to Harris's death had been the worst of his marriage. Every day felt like walking through quicksand, each step heavier than the last. Laura's demands had grown more outrageous, her family's expectations more suffocating. But Harris kept working, kept providing, kept hoping that somehow things would get better. On the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, Harris had woken up with a small spark of hope. He'd saved $75, hidden it in an envelope in his toolbox. He planned to buy Laura flowers and take her to that Italian restaurant she'd been talking about. Maybe they could reconnect. Maybe she'd remember why they'd gotten married in the first place. But when he came home that evening, exhausted and holding a bouquet of roses, he found Laura in the living room with a tall, handsome man in an expensive suit. "Harris, this is Marcus," Laura said casually, not even looking embarrassed. "He's a financial advisor. I've been talking to him about our situation." Marcus stood and shook Harris's hand with a grip that felt like a challenge. "Your wife tells me you're very conservative with money. I've been explaining to her that there are opportunities to leverage your assets for greater returns." "Leverage our assets?" Harris repeated, confused. "What assets? We don't have any assets except this house, and we still owe—" "Exactly," Laura interrupted. "We could take out a home equity loan. Marcus says we could get at least $100,000. Think of what we could do with that money." Harris felt the room spinning. "Laura, that would put us even deeper in debt. We're barely making the mortgage payments as it is." "You're barely making the payments," Laura corrected coldly. "You, not we. I'm tired of living like this, Harris. I'm 34 years old and I feel like I'm 80. When was the last time we went on a vacation? When was the last time I got to buy something nice without you making me feel guilty?" The roses in Harris's hand suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. "Laura, I work 12-hour days. I'm trying my best to—" "Your best isn't good enough," she shouted, and the words hung in the air like poison. "Maybe it never was." Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I should go. Laura, think about what I said. Call me when you're ready to make some real changes." He gave Harris a look that was almost pitying before leaving. That night, Harris lay awake in bed while Laura slept beside him, as far away as she could get without falling off. He thought about his life, about the years he'd spent trying to make her happy, trying to be enough. He thought about his father, who had died of a heart attack at 50, worked to death trying to provide for a family that never appreciated him. Harris didn't want to end up like his father. But he was already on that path, wasn't he? The next morning, Harris went to work with his mind still churning. He was distracted, exhausted, emotionally drained. At the Peterson Tower site, Frank noticed something was off. "You okay, Chen? You look like hell." "I'm fine," Harris lied. Just didn't sleep well. Well, wake up. We need you sharp today. We're installing those corner beams on the 28th floor. Tricky work. Harris nodded and climbed. 28 floors up, the wind was even stronger. The city below looked unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life. He thought about Laura's words. Your best isn't good enough. Harris, you need to hook that safety line, Paul shouted from across the beam. Harris looked down at his harness. In his distracted state, he'd forgotten to clip his secondary safety line to the anchor point. A rookie mistake, a potentially fatal mistake. He reached for the clip, and that's when his phone rang. He should have ignored it. He knew he should have ignored it. But some part of him hoped it might be Laura, calling to apologize, to tell him she didn't mean what she'd said. His hand moved to his pocket automatically. The beam shifted. Harris felt himself falling before he could process what was happening. The world became a blur of steel and sky. He heard Paul screaming his name, felt the harness catch. Thank God he'd at least clipped the primary line. But the jolt was violent, slamming him against the building's side. Something cracked. Pain exploded through his chest and back. He blacked out. When Harris woke up in the hospital 3 days later, the doctors told him he'd broken 4 ribs, fractured his spine, and suffered severe internal injuries. They told him he was lucky to be alive. They didn't tell him he'd be dead within a week, that internal bleeding they hadn't detected would slowly kill him while Laura and her family planned their future with his insurance money. Because Harris never woke up again. Not really. He drifted in and out of consciousness, heavily medicated, while Laura sat beside, his bed scrolling through her phone, calculating how much his death would be worth. On February 23rd, Harris Chen's heart stopped at 3:47 a.m. Laura was at home, sleeping peacefully. She didn't cry when they called her. She called her mother first, and Nancy's first words were, "How much was the policy worth?" Now, 3 days after the funeral, the champagne was flowing in the house Harris had broken his back to pay for. Nancy, Donald, Laura, and Erica were dividing up the money before it had even been transferred to the account. "I'm thinking of that beach house in Miami," Laura said, pulling up real estate listings on her laptop. "Something with a view. Maybe $2 million. We'll have plenty left over." "Don't forget, you promised me a car," Erica whined. "A BMW. You said I could have a BMW." "Everyone gets what they want," Nancy declared. "After years of suffering through that cheap man's penny pinching, we finally get to live the life we deserve." Donald raised his glass again. "The only good thing Harris ever did was die." They all laughed. They actually laughed. The doorbell rang. Laura groaned, annoyed at the interruption. "Probably another neighbor with a casserole. I'll get rid of them." She opened the door to find a man in a dark suit holding a briefcase. Behind him stood a woman in a police uniform. "Mrs. Chen? I'm Edward Morrison from Lighthouse Insurance Company. This is Officer Patricia Wells. May we come in?" Laura's smile was bright. "Oh, you're here about the payout. Yes, please come in. I've been expecting—" "Mrs. Chen, I'm afraid we need to discuss some irregularities with your husband's life insurance policy," Edward interrupted, his voice professional but cold. The champagne glasses froze mid-air. Nancy and Donald exchanged worried glances. "Irregularities?" Laura repeated, her smile faltering. "What kind of irregularities?" Edward opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick file. "First, I need to inform you that we've been conducting an investigation into the circumstances of your husband's death. The construction company reported that Mr. Chen appeared distracted on the day of his accident. Phone records show he received a call from your number at the exact moment he fell. Additionally, we found several witness statements suggesting Mr. Chen had been under severe emotional and financial stress." "What are you saying?" Laura demanded, her voice rising. "That I killed him? That's insane." No one is saying that, Officer Wells said calmly. But what we are saying is that the policy your husband purchased has several important clauses that need to be reviewed. Edward pulled out a document. Mrs. Chen, are you aware that your husband changed the beneficiary on his life insurance policy 3 weeks before his death? The room went silent. Laura's face drained of all color. That's not possible. I'm his wife. I'm automatically the beneficiary. Not when the policyholder specifically designates someone else, Edward explained. On February 1st, your husband visited our office and made a beneficiary change. He also added a substantial rider to the policy that you apparently weren't aware of. Who? Laura whispered. Who did he leave it to? Edward consulted his papers. The primary beneficiary is listed as the Paul Martinez Education Fund. Paul Martinez was your husband's young colleague at the construction site. According to Mr. Chen's written statement, Paul was the only person who treated him with genuine respect and kindness. Your husband established an education fund to ensure Paul could finish his engineering degree. That's $500,000, Nancy shrieked. He gave $500,000 to some random kid instead of his own family? There's more, Edward continued. Your husband also took out a reverse mortgage on this house 2 weeks before his death. He borrowed against the full equity, approximately $150,000, and donated the entire amount to several charities, including a construction workers' safety foundation and a domestic abuse support center. Laura felt her legs give out. She grabbed the wall for support. He took out a reverse mortgage? But that means this house now has a lien against it for $150,000 plus the original mortgage, Edward confirmed. Upon your husband's death, those debts become immediately payable. Additionally, we found that Mr. Chen had been documenting every loan you forced him to take from your family, every guilt trip, every financial manipulation. He left a detailed letter explaining how your family systematically drained his resources and destroyed his mental health. Officer Wells stepped forward. While no criminal charges are being filed, this documentation will be relevant to the civil suit the construction company is preparing. They're arguing that your harassment of Mr. Chen via phone calls and texts while he was working at dangerous heights constituted reckless endangerment. Their lawyers believe they can successfully defend against any wrongful death lawsuit you might file. But the insurance money, Laura stammered. Goes to Paul Martinez's education fund, as per your husband's wishes, Edward said firmly. You'll receive nothing from the life insurance policy. As for your financial situation, you have 90 days to pay off the $150,000 reverse mortgage, plus the remaining balance on your original mortgage, approximately $340,000 total, or the house will go into foreclosure. This can't be happening, Erica moaned. This can't be real. Nancy collapsed onto the couch, her face gray. We spent money. We already spent money we don't have. The credit cards, the shopping, I thought. Donald just stared at the champagne bottle, watching the bubbles slowly die in his glass. Edward Morrison closed his briefcase. Mr. Chen left one final message. He asked me to read it to you if this situation arose. He pulled out a handwritten note. It says, I hope you enjoyed the champagne. I bought that bottle 3 years ago for our anniversary, but you said it wasn't expensive enough to bother with. I've been saving it, waiting for an occasion special enough. I suppose this counts. You wanted me to think bigger, Laura. You wanted me to be less cautious. Congratulations. I finally listened. Goodbye. The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Wells and Edward Morrison let themselves out, leaving the family frozen in their grotesque celebration. The champagne had gone flat. The insurance papers Nancy had been clutching so tightly were meaningless. The real estate listings Laura had been browsing disappeared as her laptop battery died. She'd forgotten to pay the electric bill, assuming Harris's money would cover everything. Outside, the black wreath still hung on the door. But inside, where Laura and her family had been celebrating a dead man's life insurance payout, there was only the crushing weight of consequences. The hard-working husband they'd driven to exhaustion, mocked and exploited, had finally pushed back in the only way he could. From somewhere beyond, Harris Chen was finally, truly free. And for once, it was his family who would learn what it meant to struggle, to sacrifice, and to discover that sometimes the price of greed is everything you thought you had won. The champagne bottle tipped over, spilling the last drops onto Harris's carefully installed carpet, the one they'd mocked him for choosing because it was on sale. It was the most expensive champagne they would ever drink,